What happens when a deaf, solitary photographer accidentally falls asleep on a midnight train and misses his stop, only to be gently cared for by a retired military hero known as the Alpha Warlord? Welcome back to Eternal Romance Stories. Today's heartwarming Omegaverse audiobook brings you a tale of silent connection, profound respect, and a slow-burn romance proving that true love speaks a language beyond words. If you love emotional healing stories and fiercely protective alphas, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Now, let the story begin. Sometimes the kindest stranger changes your destination before you even know you were lost. The midnight train glided quietly through the snow-covered mountains as Ethan Brooks leaned against the cold window, his camera resting safely inside his worn backpack while rows of sleepy passengers settled into the peaceful rhythm of the journey. At just 22 years old, Ethan had spent most of his life traveling alone. Being born deaf had taught him to observe details other people overlooked, from the gentle expressions hidden behind tired smiles to the way sunlight reflected differently across old buildings and quiet lakes. Photography had become his language long before words ever could. Every picture he captured allowed him to tell stories without needing sound, and every trip gave him another chance to discover beauty that many people hurried past. Across the aisle sat a man almost impossible to ignore. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark wool coat over simple civilian clothing, Mason Carter attracted respectful glances without seeming to notice them. Even after retiring from military service, newspapers still occasionally referred to him as the Alpha Warlord because of the calm leadership he had shown during years spent protecting humanitarian evacuation routes rather than seeking recognition. Mason disliked the title. It reminded him of responsibilities he had fulfilled but never wished to celebrate. He preferred quiet trains, ordinary conversations, and destinations where no one recognized his face. As the hours passed, the lights inside the train dimmed while gentle snowfall blurred the windows into soft white paintings. Ethan reviewed photographs from a children's literacy event earlier that afternoon until exhaustion finally overcame him. He shifted slightly in his seat, intending only to rest for a moment before reaching his station. Instead, the steady motion of the train slowly lulled him into deep sleep. A gentle turn along the mountain tracks caused Ethan to lose his balance. Before he realized it, his head came to rest against Mason's shoulder. Several nearby passengers glanced toward the unexpected scene before quietly smiling and returning to their books. Mason looked down for only a second. The young Omega's breathing remained calm, his hands still loosely wrapped around the camera strap as though protecting something precious even while asleep. Mason noticed a small hearing device resting behind one ear and immediately understood why the station announcements drifting through the train would never wake him. He quietly reached into the seat pocket and found the printed route schedule instead of attempting to disturb Ethan. A few minutes later, the train slowed as it reached Ethan's scheduled stop. The conductor announced the station over the loudspeaker before walking through the aisle checking departing passengers. Mason gently looked toward Ethan, who remained peacefully asleep despite the movement around him. The conductor noticed the situation and smiled sympathetically. "Should I wake him?" he asked. Mason glanced once more at the young man whose face finally looked free from whatever burdens had followed him onto the train. After a brief pause, he shook his head. The conductor quietly closed the train door as the station disappeared behind them. 20 minutes later, the train arrived at the next mountain town, where severe overnight snowfall delayed all return departures until morning. Mason carefully lifted Ethan, supporting both him and the camera bag with practiced steadiness before carrying him onto the nearly empty platform. Cold mountain air drifted through the station as snowflakes settled gently across the quiet tracks. Only then did Ethan slowly open his eyes, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. He looked from the snow-covered platform to Mason standing beside him, then quickly searched the station sign before realizing he had missed his destination entirely. Mason met his startled expression with an apologetic but reassuring smile before calmly taking a small notebook from his coat pocket. In clear handwriting, he wrote a single sentence and held it where Ethan could easily read. "You looked like you finally found a peaceful dream. I could not bring myself to wake you." Ethan stared at the words for several silent seconds before looking back at the stranger who had carried both him and his camera safely through the snowy night. completely unaware that one missed train stop had quietly changed the direction of both their lives. Snow continued falling across the quiet mountain station as Ethan Brooks carefully reread the handwritten sentence in Mason Carter's notebook before looking up again. Instead of frustration, he found himself unexpectedly smiling. Few strangers had ever shown enough patience to think about what life looked like through his eyes. Ethan reached into his backpack, removed a small notebook of his own, and quickly wrote a reply. Most people would have woken me immediately. Mason accepted the notebook with a thoughtful expression before writing beneath Ethan's sentence. You looked like someone who had not rested peacefully in a long time. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, unable to deny the truth hidden inside those simple words. The station employee soon approached carrying fresh weather reports. Heavy snowfall had covered the mountain pass, delaying every departing train until after sunrise. The nearest hotel remained only a short walk from the station, and the employee kindly offered printed directions instead of spoken explanations after noticing Ethan communicating through writing. Mason quietly accepted the map but made no assumptions. He turned toward Ethan and wrote another question. Would you prefer to walk there together, or would you rather go alone? Ethan appreciated the choice more than the offer itself. Too often people decided for him before asking what he wanted. He smiled and nodded before writing, "Together is fine." They walked slowly through the peaceful streets while snowflakes drifted beneath warm streetlights, transforming the small mountain town into something that looked almost unreal. Neither man felt uncomfortable with the silence. Ethan had long ago discovered that silence could become its own conversation when shared with someone who respected it. At the hotel reception desk, the last two available rooms had just been reserved by travelers whose trains had also been delayed. The receptionist apologized before explaining that only one small family suite remained vacant because another guest had canceled moments earlier due to the weather. The suite contained two completely separate bedrooms connected by a shared sitting area. Mason immediately looked toward Ethan rather than answering for both of them. Ethan read the printed room layout and quietly nodded. It was practical, warm, and only for one night. After checking in, they settled inside the comfortable suite where a fireplace filled the sitting room with gentle warmth. Ethan removed his camera from the backpack and carefully inspected it before relaxing with visible relief that nothing had been damaged during the unexpected journey. Mason noticed the way Ethan handled the old camera with extraordinary care, almost as though it were part of his family. Curious, he pointed politely toward it before raising his eyebrows in a silent question. Ethan opened the notebook again. My grandfather gave it to me before he passed away. Every important memory I have is connected to this camera. Mason nodded with quiet understanding. Without another word, he disappeared briefly into the small kitchenette before returning with two steaming mugs of hot chocolate prepared by the hotel staff. He placed one beside Ethan along with another handwritten message. Cold nights are easier with something warm. Ethan laughed softly. The simple kindness felt surprisingly comforting. As the evening continued, Ethan reviewed photographs from recent volunteer projects, while Mason quietly read a history book near the fireplace. Occasionally their eyes met, followed by small smiles that somehow made the unfamiliar room feel unexpectedly welcoming. Hours later, Ethan accidentally dropped a folded notebook from his backpack while organizing his camera equipment. Mason bent to retrieve it but paused when the first visible page revealed careful sketches of hands forming American Sign Language. Before Mason could hand it back, Ethan looked slightly embarrassed and quickly wrote, I draw signs because they help me remember people. Mason stared at the sketches for a brief moment before slowly raising one hand. With calm confidence, he formed a simple sign Ethan recognized instantly. It meant, good evening. Ethan's eyes widened with complete surprise. No explanation had prepared him for seeing flawless sign language from the quiet stranger sitting across the room. Mason smiled gently before signing one more sentence with natural ease. I hope I remembered correctly. For the first time since boarding the train, Ethan realized the silence between them had never truly been empty. Somehow, without either of them expecting it, they had already begun speaking the same language. Ethan Brooks remained completely still as Mason Carter finished the final sign. The movement of his hands had been natural, confident, and unmistakably fluent. Ethan blinked several times before instinctively signing a question instead of reaching for his notebook. "Where did you learn?" Mason understood immediately. A quiet smile crossed his face as he answered in the same graceful language. Many years ago, Ethan had grown accustomed to repeating signs or slowing his movements whenever he met hearing people who knew only a few basic gestures. With Mason, every response arrived effortlessly, almost as though they had been having silent conversations for years. The comfortable rhythm surprised them both. Mason leaned back slightly before continuing. "My younger sister lost her hearing after a serious illness when we were children. I learned American Sign Language because I wanted her to know she would never have to face silence alone." Ethan's expression softened. "Does she still use it?" Mason lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "She passed away several years ago, but I never stopped practicing because I promised myself I would never forget the language she gave me." The warmth inside the hotel suite suddenly felt even quieter than before. Ethan slowly signed. "She would be proud that you kept your promise." Mason looked at him for a long moment before offering a grateful smile that needed no translation. The conversation continued naturally without either of them noticing how much time had passed. They discussed photography, travel, favorite places, and childhood memories entirely through sign language. Ethan laughed more than he had in months, delighted to communicate without constantly explaining himself. Mason listened with genuine attention, never interrupting, never finishing Ethan's thoughts, and never pretending to understand something he had missed. That simple respect meant more than Ethan could easily express. Later in the evening, Ethan showed Mason photographs from volunteer projects he had completed across the country. Images of children reading in small libraries, elderly couples donating books, and quiet mountain towns filled the camera screen. Mason studied every picture carefully before signing. "You always photograph hope." Ethan looked surprised. Few people had ever described his work that way. He answered honestly, "There is already enough sadness in the world. I want people to remember what is still worth protecting." Mason quietly nodded, recognizing words that reflected his own beliefs more closely than he expected. The following morning, bright sunlight reflected across fresh snow as the storm finally cleared. Train service would resume within the hour. Before leaving the hotel, Ethan stepped outside carrying his camera, fascinated by the untouched landscape surrounding the small mountain town. He raised the lens toward the rising sun when he noticed Mason standing quietly beside an old wooden bridge overlooking the valley. Without thinking, Ethan captured the moment. The photograph revealed a powerful Alpha standing alone against a breathtaking winter horizon. Yet his calm expression carried remarkable gentleness instead of authority. Mason noticed the camera and smiled with amused curiosity. Ethan hurried over, slightly embarrassed, and showed him the image. Mason studied it for several seconds before signing. "No one has ever photographed me like this." Ethan tilted his head questioningly. Mason answered, "Most people see the uniform before they see the person." Ethan looked directly into Mason's eyes before signing one simple sentence. "I never met the uniform." Mason stood silently as those words settled deeply within him. For years, people had recognized the reputation attached to his name before learning anything about the man himself. Ethan had done exactly the opposite. As they walked back toward the station together, a large digital news display inside the terminal suddenly illuminated with the morning headlines. Ethan paused as a photograph of Mason appeared across the screen beside bold letters identifying him as the celebrated Alpha Warlord, whose humanitarian leadership had recently received another national honor. Ethan slowly looked from the screen back to the quiet man walking beside him, realizing the stranger who had gently carried him through the snow was someone the entire country already believed it knew. The bright headline remained on the station screen long after Ethan Brooks lowered his camera. Travelers paused to admire the news before continuing toward their platforms. But Ethan's attention stayed fixed on Mason Carter. The calm Alpha standing beside him looked nothing like the larger-than-life figure described by the newspapers. There were no bodyguards, no dramatic entrance, and no trace of arrogance. Mason simply adjusted the strap of his travel bag before signing with a slightly embarrassed smile. "I usually try to miss those announcements," Ethan looked back at the screen where reporters praised Mason's years of humanitarian leadership during dangerous rescue operations, calling him the legendary Alpha Warlord whose decisions had saved countless civilians during international relief missions. Ethan slowly signed. "Why did you never tell me?" Mason answered honestly without hesitation. "Because I wanted you to meet me before you met the reputation." Ethan quietly nodded. Somehow that answer made perfect sense. Moments later, the morning train finally arrived. Snow still covered the mountains, but the skies had cleared into brilliant shades of blue. They boarded together, returning to the same seats they had occupied the previous evening. This time, neither of them pretended to be strangers. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than uncertain, interrupted only by quiet conversations spoken through graceful movements of their hands. As the train traveled through frozen valleys, passengers occasionally recognized Mason from the news. Several politely approached to thank him for helping relatives during past humanitarian evacuations. Mason greeted every person with genuine warmth before returning to Ethan without making himself the center of attention. Watching those brief conversations, Ethan noticed something the newspaper articles had never captured. Every person who thanked Mason smiled because of kindness they had personally experienced, not because of stories they had heard. Ethan lifted his camera and discreetly photographed one such moment. Mason gently helping an elderly passenger place a heavy suitcase onto the luggage rack. There were no reporters nearby, no official photographers, and no audience. It was simply another quiet act of consideration. Ethan smiled to himself. This was the man he wanted to remember. Several hours later, the train reached a small regional station where Mason unexpectedly stood. Ethan looked up with visible surprise. According to the schedule, Mason was supposed to continue much farther east. Mason signed, "My meeting can wait." Ethan raised an eyebrow questioningly. Mason continued with a calm expression. "There is a community rehabilitation center nearby. Some former service members volunteer there with children who have hearing loss. I visit whenever I travel through this region." Curiosity immediately replaced Ethan's surprise. Mason noticed the expression and smiled. "Would you like to come?" Ethan accepted without hesitation. The rehabilitation center occupied a renovated elementary school surrounded by pine trees and colorful murals painted by local families. Inside, children laughed while communicating through American Sign Language, drawing pictures, reading stories, and learning together. Volunteers greeted Mason with obvious affection rather than formal respect. One little boy immediately ran toward him holding a drawing of mountains and trains. Mason knelt to admire the picture before signing enthusiastic praise that made the child beam with pride. Ethan quietly captured the moment with his camera. Every photograph revealed another side of Mason that the headlines had never shown. During the afternoon, one of the senior volunteers recognized Ethan's camera and asked if he would photograph the center's annual family exhibition. Ethan happily agreed. As he documented smiling children, devoted teachers, and patient volunteers, he realized this place represented everything he believed photography should preserve. Near sunset, the center director approached carrying an old scrapbook filled with photographs from many years earlier. She smiled warmly before handing it to Ethan. "Mason visits every year," she explained. "The children call him their quiet guardian because he always arrives before anyone asks for help." Ethan slowly opened the scrapbook and turned the first page. Every photograph showed the same Alpha standing beside children, teachers, and families, never seeking attention, always standing slightly behind everyone else. For the first time, Ethan understood that Mason's greatest victories had never appeared in newspaper headlines at all. The scrapbook remained open across Ethan Brooks's lap long after the afternoon activities ended. Every faded photograph revealed another quiet chapter of Mason Carter's life that no newspaper had ever reported. There were pictures of children proudly holding graduation certificates, families planting community gardens beside rehabilitation centers, volunteers rebuilding classrooms after severe winter storms, and Mason standing in the background of nearly every image with the same calm smile. He never occupied the center of the frame. Instead, he always seemed happiest watching other people succeed. Ethan carefully turned another page before pausing at a photograph nearly 10 years old. A much younger Mason stood beside a teenage girl using American Sign Language while teaching several children how to communicate through simple hand movements. Ethan looked toward Mason with gentle curiosity. Mason immediately recognized the photograph and quietly signed, "My sister asked me to teach every child I could. She believed no one should ever feel isolated because other people refused to learn their language." Ethan slowly closed the scrapbook, deeply moved by the promise Mason had continued honoring year after year. Before either of them could continue the conversation, a distinguished older gentleman entered the rehabilitation center carrying several donated books. Staff members warmly greeted him as retired General William Harper, one of Mason's former commanding officers. After exchanging friendly greetings, the general noticed Ethan standing beside Mason and smiled knowingly. "So you are finally traveling with someone who photographs your real life instead of your public life," he said warmly. Mason laughed softly. "I suppose I am." The general turned toward Ethan. "You probably know him as the famous Alpha everyone praises." I knew the young officer who constantly volunteered for assignments involving evacuation routes because he believed protecting civilians mattered more than receiving medals. Ethan listened quietly while the general continued. There were many opportunities for Mason to build a much more celebrated career, but every important decision he made was based on helping people return safely to their families. Mason looked slightly embarrassed by the compliments and gently changed the subject by helping volunteers organize the newly donated books. Ethan noticed the familiar pattern once again. Mason never seemed comfortable discussing his own accomplishments. Later that afternoon, the rehabilitation center hosted a small exhibition displaying artwork created by children who communicated primarily through sign language. Ethan eagerly photographed every painting, sculpture, and handwritten story, while the young artists proudly explained their inspiration through expressive gestures. One little girl approached Ethan carrying a drawing of a train traveling through snowy mountains. She pointed first toward the picture, then toward Mason, and finally signed with a bright smile. "He says trains bring people together." Ethan looked at Mason with amused surprise. Mason shrugged playfully before signing back, "Sometimes they do." The simple exchange made everyone nearby smile. As evening approached, Ethan prepared to continue his journey home, while Mason received a message requesting his presence at an international humanitarian planning conference scheduled for the following morning. Their paths would soon separate. Standing together outside the rehabilitation center beneath golden sunset light, neither of them seemed eager to say goodbye. Ethan opened his notebook one last time and carefully wrote, "Thank you for carrying me when I did not even know I needed help." Mason accepted the notebook, reading the sentence slowly before taking the pen. After a thoughtful pause, he wrote beneath Ethan's words, "You helped me remember that peace can begin with something as simple as sharing silence with the right person." Ethan smiled warmly, slipping the notebook safely into his backpack beside his grandfather's camera. As they walked together toward the quiet train platform, neither of them realized a local newspaper photographer had captured a candid image of the two, silently communicating through sign language beneath the setting sun. By the following morning, that single photograph would quietly travel across thousands of news feeds, inspiring countless strangers while unknowingly setting both of their lives on an entirely new course. The photograph spread across news websites far more quickly than either Ethan Brooks or Mason Carter ever expected. It showed no dramatic speech, no ceremony, and no military recognition. Instead, the image captured a quiet moment beneath the golden evening sky where two people communicated entirely through American Sign Language, smiling with complete sincerity while standing beside a small rural train station. Thousands of readers commented that it was the most genuine photograph they had seen in years. Some recognized Mason immediately. Others simply noticed the kindness reflected in his expression. Ethan discovered the photograph the following morning while organizing pictures inside his small apartment. He smiled quietly before setting the article aside, believing the attention would disappear within a few days. Meanwhile, Mason had already arrived at the International Humanitarian Conference where educators, medical specialists, and community leaders gathered to discuss programs supporting veterans and people with disabilities. Throughout the opening sessions, several delegates congratulated him on the widely shared photograph. Mason accepted every compliment politely but redirected the conversations toward the importance of accessible communication rather than himself. During one presentation, a speaker displayed the photograph on a large screen while discussing how simple acts of inclusion often inspire broader social change. Mason watched silently from the audience, unexpectedly realizing how much the brief encounter with Ethan had already influenced others without either of them planning it. Several days later, Ethan received an email from the rehabilitation center asking permission to display some of his photographs in an upcoming traveling exhibition celebrating communication beyond spoken language. He happily agreed and immediately began selecting images from recent volunteer projects. While reviewing hundreds of photographs, he paused at the portrait he had taken of Mason standing alone beside the snow-covered bridge that morning in the mountains. Looking at it now, Ethan understood why the picture felt different from every other portrait he had captured. It was the first photograph where someone had trusted him enough to simply exist without performing for the camera. Weeks passed as both men returned to their separate routines. Ethan continued traveling across the country documenting literacy projects, community libraries, and volunteer organizations. Mason resumed visiting rehabilitation centers, educational programs, and humanitarian initiatives between official responsibilities. Although distance separated them, small reminders quietly appeared everywhere. Ethan occasionally noticed children practicing sign language after schools introduced new accessibility programs inspired by the exhibition. Mason often saw volunteers carrying cameras similar to Ethan's while documenting community events. Neither expected these moments to affect them so deeply. One rainy afternoon, Ethan received another unexpected message from the rehabilitation center director. She explained that the traveling exhibition had become so successful that organizers planned to expand it nationwide. At the end of the email, one sentence stood out above everything else. The opening ceremony will be held in Washington, and Mr. Mason Carter has accepted an invitation to deliver the keynote address about inclusive communication. Ethan stared at the screen for several silent moments before smiling almost unconsciously. Several hundred miles away, Mason received the same schedule from the organizing committee. His eyes immediately found Ethan's name listed as the exhibition's featured photographer. For the first time in many years, Mason felt genuinely eager for an official event rather than simply viewing it as another obligation. Neither of them contacted the other beforehand. Somehow it felt unnecessary. Both already understood that the quiet trust formed during one unexpected night in the mountains had never truly disappeared. As the opening day of the exhibition finally arrived, visitors filled the grand gallery long before the ceremony began. Large photographs lined the walls, telling stories of compassion, resilience, education, and hope. At the very center of the exhibition hung a single image illuminated beneath soft lights. It was the photograph of Mason standing peacefully beside the snow-covered bridge. As Ethan adjusted the final display moments before the doors officially opened, he sensed someone quietly stop beside him. Without needing to turn around, he somehow already knew exactly who had arrived. Without turning around, Ethan Brooks slowly smiled because he already recognized the quiet presence standing beside him. Mason Carter remained silent for several seconds, studying the large photograph displayed at the center of the exhibition. Beneath soft gallery lighting, the portrait showed a man standing peacefully beside a snow-covered bridge, looking toward the distant mountains with an expression of calm hope rather than military strength. Visitors who paused before the image often whispered that the photograph felt strangely comforting, even if they knew nothing about the person inside it. Mason finally signed, "I still cannot believe you saw me like that." Ethan looked toward him before answering with a gentle smile. "That is who you were the entire time." Their silent conversation continued naturally while guests gradually filled the exhibition hall around them. Some recognized Mason immediately and politely greeted him. Others approached Ethan to compliment the photographs documenting literacy programs, rehabilitation centers, classrooms, and families communicating through American Sign Language. Every image shared the same quiet message. People become strongest when they choose to understand one another. During the opening ceremony, the exhibition director welcomed everyone before inviting Mason to speak. Instead of standing behind the formal podium prepared for him, Mason walked directly toward the center of the gallery where Ethan's photographs surrounded the audience. He looked across the room before beginning in a calm voice. Many people believe leadership begins with giving orders. I spent years believing that too. Then I learned something far more important. Leadership begins when we choose to listen, even when someone communicates differently from us. As an interpreter translated every sentence into American Sign Language, Ethan watched visitors quietly nod in agreement. Mason continued, "The photographer whose work surrounds us today never asked me about medals or titles. He only wanted to know the people behind every story. Because of that simple kindness, he reminded me that every community becomes stronger when every voice, every hand, and every heart has the opportunity to be understood." When the audience applauded, Mason immediately stepped away from the spotlight and invited Ethan to join him instead. Ethan looked surprised but accepted with a modest smile. Rather than delivering a prepared speech, he simply signed one short sentence while the interpreter voiced it for the audience. The best photographs are created when people feel safe enough to be themselves. The gallery became completely silent before another wave of warm applause filled the room. Throughout the afternoon, visitors explored the exhibition, while children eagerly practiced simple signs taught by volunteers. Families gathered around interactive displays where hearing and deaf guests communicated together through games, stories, and shared activities. Watching those moments unfold, Ethan quietly realized the exhibition had already become much more than a collection of photographs. It had become a place where strangers discovered new ways to understand one another. As evening approached and the final visitors departed, Mason and Ethan helped volunteers carefully organize the gallery before walking together outside into the cool spring air. Cherry blossoms drifted gently across the quiet plaza surrounding the museum. Mason stopped beside a small reflecting pool before signing slowly, "I received another assignment today." Ethan looked at him with calm curiosity. Mason continued, "A new national program wants someone to lead partnerships between rehabilitation centers and schools for children with hearing loss." Ethan smiled warmly before signing, "You will accept." Mason gently shook his head. "Not unless someone agrees to lead the storytelling side beside me." Ethan looked surprised. Mason reached into his briefcase and carefully removed an official proposal prepared by the organizing committee. Across the top of the first page appeared both of their names listed together as co-directors of the nationwide initiative. Ethan looked from the document back to Mason, his eyes widening with quiet emotion. Mason smiled with the same kindness that had first greeted him on the snowy train platform months earlier before signing one final sentence. "The first journey happened because we missed one stop. Perhaps the next one begins because we finally found the right destination together." Several months after accepting the nationwide initiative, Ethan Brooks and Mason Carter found themselves traveling across the country more often than either of them had imagined. Their shared mission connected rehabilitation centers, public schools, libraries, and community organizations through programs designed to make communication more accessible for everyone. Every destination offered a different story. In one town, they helped teachers learn American Sign Language alongside their students. In another, they organized photography workshops where deaf children expressed emotions through images instead of spoken words. Everywhere they traveled, Ethan quietly documented moments of genuine connection, while Mason coordinated volunteers, educators, and community leaders with the same calm dedication that had earned him respect long before they met. Gradually, people stopped introducing them separately. Newspapers referred to them as partners in the National Accessibility Project, while volunteers simply smiled whenever they saw the familiar photographer carrying his vintage camera beside the composed Alpha whose greatest talent remained bringing people together. Neither of them had planned for that reputation, yet both accepted it with quiet gratitude. One bright summer morning, they arrived at a newly renovated learning center overlooking a peaceful lake. Hundreds of children gathered for the grand opening, excited to explore classrooms specially designed for students with different communication needs. Colorful murals decorated every hallway, interactive exhibits encouraged hearing and deaf children to learn together, and every welcome sign appeared in both written English and American Sign Language. Ethan moved naturally through the celebration, capturing laughter, curiosity, and small acts of kindness that often escaped everyone else's attention. Mason spent hours greeting families individually, making certain every visitor felt included before the official ceremony even began. During lunch, a young boy approached Ethan carrying a camera almost identical to the one his grandfather had given him years earlier. Through careful sign language, the child explained that seeing Ethan's photographs had inspired him to believe he could someday become a professional photographer despite being deaf. Ethan smiled warmly before kneeling to adjust the camera strap on the boy's shoulder exactly as his own grandfather had once done for him. Mason quietly watched from several feet away, recognizing that Ethan had unknowingly become the kind of role model he had always admired in others. Later that afternoon, the center organized a group photograph including students, teachers, volunteers, and local families. Ethan prepared to stand behind the camera as usual until several children enthusiastically protested through sign language. They insisted the photographer belonged in the picture because he was part of their story too. Laughing softly, Ethan reluctantly handed his camera to another volunteer before joining the group. Mason naturally stepped beside him without hesitation. As the shutter clicked, dozens of smiling children simultaneously signed the phrase, "Thank you," creating one unforgettable image filled not with perfect poses, but with genuine appreciation. After the celebration ended, Ethan and Mason walked together along the quiet lakeside boardwalk, while golden evening sunlight reflected across the water. The peaceful silence between them no longer felt unfamiliar. It had become one of the places where both of them felt most understood. Ethan paused to photograph the sunset before lowering his camera and turning toward Mason. Through gentle movements of his hands, he signed, "Do you remember the first train?" Mason smiled immediately. "Every detail." Ethan laughed softly. "I used to think missing my station was the worst mistake of that trip." Mason looked toward the distant railroad tracks stretching across the valley before answering with complete sincerity. "It was never a mistake. It was simply the beginning of a journey neither of us could have planned." Ethan stood quietly beside him, realizing how extraordinary those ordinary words truly were. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated with a message from the National Transportation Authority announcing a new educational campaign celebrating accessible travel across the country. Attached to the invitation was one surprising request. They wanted Ethan and Mason to become the public faces of the campaign by recreating the unforgettable train journey that had first brought them together, returning to the very same route where one missed stop had quietly changed two lives forever. The invitation arrived on a crisp autumn morning, and neither Ethan Brooks nor Mason Carter needed long to decide. A few weeks later, they stood together on the very same railway platform where an unexpected snowstorm had quietly altered the course of both their lives. The Transportation Authority had restored the original route for a nationwide campaign celebrating accessible travel, but for Ethan and Mason the journey meant something far more personal than a public event. As passengers boarded, families, students, teachers, and volunteers from communities they had visited over the past year filled several train cars, many of them communicating through both spoken English and American Sign Language. Children eagerly waved toward Ethan while proudly carrying cameras or sketchbooks inspired by the workshops he had led. Others hurried to greet Mason, thanking him for helping establish programs that had given their schools new opportunities for inclusion. Watching those joyful reunions, Ethan quietly realized that the journey they had begun together no longer belonged only to them. It had become part of many other lives as well. Once the train began moving, reporters respectfully stepped aside, allowing the passengers to enjoy the experience without interruption. Ethan walked through the cars, capturing candid photographs filled with laughter, friendship, and quiet understanding. Every image reflected the same lesson he had learned months earlier. The smallest moments often carried the greatest meaning. Eventually, he returned to the familiar pair of seats near the window where he and Mason had first met. Sunlight replaced the snow that had once covered the mountains, yet the peaceful rhythm of the train felt exactly the same. Mason looked toward Ethan before smiling gently and signing, "This time I know exactly where your stop is." Ethan laughed, shaking his head with amused affection before answering, "Maybe I do not mind if we miss it again." Both of them smiled as the memory settled warmly between them. Later that afternoon, the train paused briefly at the small mountain town where they had unexpectedly spent that unforgettable winter night. The station had changed very little. The same platform overlooked the quiet valley, while flower boxes now decorated the entrance where snow had once drifted across the tracks. The Transportation Authority had placed a simple commemorative plaque nearby, celebrating the importance of accessible travel and respectful communication. Rather than focusing on individual achievements, the inscription honored every traveler who chose patience, empathy, and understanding. Ethan photographed the plaque before turning his camera toward Mason. Instead of posing formally, Mason simply stood beside the station sign with the same calm expression Ethan had admired from the very beginning. Ethan captured one final photograph, knowing immediately that it would become his favorite. As evening approached, passengers gathered in the dining car for a small celebration. Teachers, volunteers, children, veterans, photographers, and railway employees shared stories about unexpected friendships that had changed their lives. Many admitted they had first become interested in accessibility after seeing one simple photograph of two strangers communicating through sign language at a quiet station months earlier. Hearing those stories filled Ethan and Mason with quiet gratitude. Near sunset, the train resumed its final stretch through the mountains. Ethan returned to his seat beside Mason and, without hesitation, gently rested his head against Mason's shoulder exactly as he had on that first journey. This time neither of them was surprised. Mason looked out at the passing landscape before slowly raising his hand. With patient, graceful movements he signed the words Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. We never missed the right destination. We simply needed the journey to find it together. Ethan smiled, closed his eyes for a peaceful moment, and lightly intertwined his fingers with Mason's as the train continued forward beneath a sky painted with warm evening light. Outside the window, the mountains gradually disappeared into the horizon, but inside the quiet train neither of them feared the next stop anymore, because wherever the journey continued, they had already found the place where they both belonged. From a missed train stop in the snow to a lifetime of traveling side by side. What an incredibly satisfying and healing ending. Ethan and Mason proved that true love isn't about rushing to a destination, but about finding the right person to share the silence and the journey with. Did this heartwarming romance capture your heart? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe to Eternal Romance Stories, and click the video on your screen for more unforgettable audiobooks. See you next time.